Hi, welcome to the Bioinformatics chat. Today I'm talking to Loïc Paulevé. Loïc is a permanent researcher at CNRS. He's based in Bordeaux, France. Loïc, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, thanks for having me.
So we will be talking about Boolean networks and different interpretations of Boolean networks. And I guess this falls into a broader category, broader field of systems biology. And this is the first time on the podcast when we talk about systems biology. So why don't you give us some introduction what this branch of computational biology does?
So systems biology is the study of biological processes at the system level. So where we try to figure out the interaction between the components and what the effects they have. For instance, if one component change of activity in one place of the cell, it may have a strong effect at very different location to very different proteins.
So let's deconstruct that a little bit. So when you say components, what do you mean? And when you say the systems level, what is that, and what other levels are there?
Yes. So by components, it could be a lot of things we can think in for instance, in the cells. So it could be proteins, genes, or subcase of proteins, receptors at the membrane level, metabolites. Anything we can think of that is present in the cell, for instance, could also be organs, species at very different scales. It really depends on the systems we want to study, and then we pick the actors that we think are relevant for studying the process we look at. So, for instance, when we look at cell differentiation processes, we may be very interested in looking at what happened at the gene level, at the gene activity, and the activity of some proteins, of key proteins, and so on. So it's really broad view of what a system is and what a process is, and so we pick as actors we want. And depending on what we pick, the modeling will be very different, and the kind of analysis we can do can be very, very different.
Right. And so one of the central concepts in systems biology is networks, right? So what are these networks? So naively, we can think about networks as just graphs, and it's not even clear why have a separate term network. Like, how is it different from a graph? But what do systems biologists put into this notion of a network?
Yeah, so of course, graph is a part of the description of a network. So in a graph, you will describe pairwise interaction between components, so that you know that this particular protein can, for instance, bind to this other one, or can have an effect on this particular gene. And on top of that, we also have so very often directionality. So that's this component has an effect on that one, and it's not a symmetric effect. And we also have, on top of that, a notion of activity, of state of the components. So that we say that, for instance, a protein is active, a gene is expressed, a thing like that. So that's states that we can sometimes observe, and sometimes it comes from interpretation from data. And then a network model in systems biology tries to predict how this state of all the components of the system we picked evolve in time.
And specifically, we will be talking about Boolean networks. So what are Boolean networks? What other kind of networks are there?
Yeah, so Boolean networks refers to a certain kind of state of the component we choose to interpret the system. So maybe before going really into Boolean view, a lot of models initially come from are expressed with differential equations, where we model evolution of, for instance, the concentration of metabolites. So you see that now the state of your components, which could be, for instance, metabolites, are concentrations, so continuous value, and you have rules to compute over time how this concentration evolve. And with differential equation, it's differential equation which express this change of quantity with respect to the value of over quantity in the network. So with Boolean networks, the state of a component is just on or off, 0, 1, and so on. And so it's like a simplification and abstraction, coarse-grained view of the activity of the system, which comes from the modeling of mainly gene regulation and also signaling networks. But so, for instance, for gene, it's quite natural to see this Boolean view because it has been observed that once the gene is, so the machinery to express the gene is really starting, it should like fully expressed, and so it produces a lot of proteins. And when its activation mechanism is below a certain threshold, the production stops very sharply. And so we can see this as a kind of off and on behavior, where if you have the right transcription factors binding in the on the DNA and no inhibitors messing around, then you can express your gene. And if you don't have that, or if you have an inhibitor binding and blocking the polymerase for the transcription mechanism, then you cannot express your gene anymore. So this has been introduced for biology in the 60s on 2 different continents, in the US, on one part with Stuart Kaufman, and in Belgium with René Thomas. So René Thomas was a biologist working on genes, and then went into this theoretical biology field of modeling. And so they proposed to model these genes networks with this Boolean variable, so saying that the gene is either on and off, and having rules to say when they turn off, when they turn on.
So what benefits do you gain by approximating an ODE model and a differential equation model with a Boolean network?
Exactly. So the point when you want to do these very precise models with ODEs, for instance, is that you need a lot of parameters. You need to tune to say at which speed the production happen, what are the affinities of interactions. So a lot of parameters, a lot of details that we often don't have at the scale of the system. With Boolean networks, you just have to specify this logic of activation, like you need this transcription factor and this inhibitor should not be here, and you can start reasoning with your model. So it's like very convenient way of approaching a system because you can quickly start reasoning on it without having to find a lot of parameters which are very, very difficult to take experimentally.
Yeah, but with a differential equation model, one thing you can do is to simulate, right, how the system will behave exactly, or maybe with some noise. But with a Boolean network, right, is it too rough an approximation to be able to simulate, to be able to predict how the system will behave?
Yeah, so intuitively, the idea is, so you can simulate a Boolean network, and we will enter into a bit more details there in a minute. But there are some tight relation between simulation of Boolean networks and ODE model. Well, some kind of family of ODE model. So it also very depends on the kind of properties you want to see. With Boolean networks, you cannot really address questions related to a precise increase in quantity of some components because we are just in very coarse-grained view of the system. But you may want to reason already on for instance, what will be the signal to send to signaling pathway to activate this gene downstream. So these are the things the kind of property you may want to address with Boolean networks. So how do we simulate Boolean networks? So the idea is exactly like with ODEs. We assign a state to each component in the system. So the initial concentration. So here it will be an initial Boolean state. And then we have to apply the rules of the model that will tell us what component change and in which direction, if they go to 1 or they go to 0. There's a lot of details here. And this is one of the main topic of the paper we are discussing about. So one of the main detail here is which component change of value and in which order. So if you have, let's say, 3 genes, and in some contexts they can all become active, how do you compute the next state? Are all the components changing of state together, synchronously, simultaneously? They all go from 0 to 1 in one instant? Or is it only one that will go active and then another one, and then we need to choose which one? So this is what we call the update mode of the Boolean networks, and more generally what we call in computer science for the semantics of your model. So how do you execute your model? How do you compute the evolution of state in time?
Yeah. And this is a fascinating question because normally, like as you say, in computer science, we could be concerned with like minute details of like a semantics of a programming language, but to an outsider, that's a very boring stuff because like every programmer knows how the programming language works. It's just computer scientists who obsess over the semantics of the programming language. And so especially in biology, we don't often think about semantics, right? But this is one of those cases where it actually like really useful to decompose, to decouple those two things, the syntax and semantics. And maybe let's start with the syntax. Let's start with, how do you specify a Boolean network? How do you maybe write it down or draw it?
Yes. So Boolean network. So again, we have a set of components that we have picked for our model. So in biology, they all have fancy names because they come from genes and proteins. As I'm a computer scientist, I give them just numbers. So 1, 2, 3, that's my variables. And what you specify in a Boolean network is just one thing, is a function which, given the Boolean state of the component of the network, what is the next state of each component. So at the end, it's a function which takes a binary vector as input, which is the state of my whole system, and just outputs 1, 0, 1 and you have that for each component. So very often we express it with propositional logic. So for instance, we have that to activate node 1, we need that the node 2 is active and not node 3 inactive, for instance, and not 3. So that's a very simple way of specifying the system. You see there is no apparent parameter. The parameter is exactly this logical function you pick. So do you put an AND? Do you put an OR? Do you put a negation? That's the parameter you have of the system. And that's it.
Right. So intuitively, each component, each metabolite or gene has a logical rule that tells whether it'll be active or inactive based on the values of other components. But you can put all those rules into a single function, right, that works from the vector of Boolean states to a new vector of Boolean states.
Exactly. This is at the end. This is what you get: a simple Boolean function which maps Boolean vectors of a fixed dimension.
And once you have this function, the natural semantic seems to be just to apply this function repeatedly, right? You have the initial vector of states, of Boolean states, then you repeatedly apply this function to get new states, and I guess this is known as the synchronous model. But why is this not the only semantics? Why does it pay off to consider other ways of simulating the model?
So indeed. So Stuart Kaufman, when he introduced Boolean networks for biology, this is exactly the way he said he defines the semantics of the Boolean functions. This also refers to very fundamental objects in mathematics and computer science related to cellular automata and so on. Then what happens is that when you go from 0 to 1, it means that in terms of gene expression, for instance, or proteins concentration, that you go above a certain threshold. And intuitively, you may say that in biological system, we observe a lot of different kinetics, a lot of different speed of activation of different components. And some components will take a lot of time to go from 0 to 1, whereas others can do it very shortly in time. And so on the other hand, René Thomas, when he introduced Boolean networks for biology, picked this opposite view that when you are in the state, the argument was it's very unlikely that you observe two components changing of qualitative states simultaneously. So only one of them will change at a time. And so this is what we call also the fully asynchronous semantics. So you have to decide which component changes, but only one component changes at a time. So this choice, as we have no parameters, no speed parameters, we have no clue for it. So we do it randomly. So we consider that any component that can change a value can change, but only one of them will change. So it introduces choices, so we can see that as branches in your dynamical system, or depending on the choice you make, that of a component will change a value, and then you process that again.
So it looks like this, not the fully asynchronous model where just one variable can change at a time, but this, I don't know what the name is, just a synchronous model where any number, of variables can change. This seems like the most flexible semantics that we can come up with for a Boolean network, because it says, almost anything can happen that roughly corresponds to our Boolean rules, right? So a variable either doesn't change or changes according to the rules, and any number of variables can change at a time. Now, is that semantics really the most flexible, or does it have any limitations?
Yeah, so that's really the point of this paper, is that we show that this asynchronous, very general view can actually miss some behaviors. But so this is related to how we want to validate a model, because we devise these rules. We can simulate, we can predict behaviors. So the question when we do model, of course, is how do we validate them with respect to reality? So typically the kind of data we have is activity of some genes. Let's say I caricature a bit this over time, and we also have observation that indicate that the cell is steady, which means that everything is almost stable, doesn't vary much over time. And so the idea when we want to validate a model is we want to make sure that it can reproduce at least what we observe. So if I observe that by starting with all my genes between inactive and I lighten the system by exciting a transcription, a membrane, a receptor as a membrane, for instance, and I observe that some gene activate, I expect that my model predict this activation. And so what I will do is that I will do, for instance, a simulation or a complete analysis of what the system can do, starting from the same configuration as my observations, and see if I can indeed, by a choice of update, reach a state where my genes activate. So predicting these steps, computing these steps is really key, is a key ingredient when you want to validate a system. And so you may ask the question, which one I have to pick to make my predictions. What we found out is that even if you pick this very asynchronous way of seeing the evolution of the system where any number of components can evolve simultaneously, actually you will say that some models are wrong, whereas actually the logic they have, their specification is correct. And this actually comes from the fact that, well, as we are Boolean, and this biological system is not binary at all. Actually, when you apply these rules, you may miss some behaviors happening due to very particular speed of reaction that you won't be able to compute. So maybe we can illustrate this with a very small example that I guess you'll have the picture. It's a very simple system where you have 3 components. You have an input. So you may think it as a gene or, for instance, in gene circuits. And this input, you can control it with a signal. You can control its activity with a signal. And this input has a direct negative effect on the output. So it means that if the input has a strong activity, it will repress the activity of the output. So to make sure that the output doesn't express. But indirectly, through a second intermediate node, let's say, it activates this output. So this input will also activate an intermediate node 2, and this node 2 will also activate 3. And so what, depending on the kinetic, so you can make ODE models of this kind of systems. You can make synthetic gene circuits, so people have done that. And then you can measure the activity of the output with respect to the signal you sent.
Just for the reference, the circuit you described, right, has a name or a nomenclature?
Exactly. So this is what we call a feed-forward loop, because you have 2 different paths from the input to the output. And it is qualified as incoherent because the input on one path has a negative effect and on the other path has a positive effect. And this specific one we study here is among this incoherent feed-forward loop is a particular one, which is the number 3. So it's the third incoherent feed-forward loop, yes.
So that people can, for example, Google it and find the picture, or I'm sure we'll include the picture in the show notes.
Yeah. And so what has been observed is that depending on the kinetics of the speed of these different interaction, when you plug on the signal, you will see a bump on the activity of 3. It means that actually, if the intermediate, the positive path is fast enough, it can activate 3. So 3 will increase, have some activity for some time, and then when 1 is high enough, it will repress it. And so we see this transient activity of 3, which may have a lot of effect downstream. For instance, if 3 is connected to other as influences on components on the network, you may think that during this pulse, it can trigger a lot of effect in the network. But so we can see it as with ODE models. We can see it with a lot of models with parameters, with quantities. But if you look at it at the Boolean level, it's very funny because it's really impossible to predict that 3 can be active even for a short time. And it's because when you start where everyone is off and you switch on 1, because 1 is on, you will never be able to activate 3. Because the rule says that to activate 3, you need that 1 is to be not active enough. So whatever the order or the number of components you update simultaneously or not, it will be very impossible to see this transient activity. And so if we go back to the validation of the model, if you just stay at this level, you will say, okay, so this is probably not the good logic because I cannot reproduce these dynamics. And it means I will need to change the logic or to consider other kind of interactions.
So that's the price we pay for the oversimplification, right, of an ODE model, because this particular behavior that you described, the spike in the output quantity, it relies on the specific configuration of the activation thresholds, for example, right? So that you have this indirect path, which one would expect to be slower than the direct path, but maybe because of the different activation thresholds, it happens earlier. The activation happens earlier than the suppression, right? And in the ODE model, we have all these parameters that we can tweak to achieve this behavior. But in a Boolean networks, where we got rid of all the parameters, we have no sort of degrees of freedom to find this.
Yes, so that's exactly the question is it really due to the Boolean abstraction? That because it's really embarrassing, let's say it like that, because it means that we simplify the model, we have a coarse-grained view of it, but we cannot be sure that if we cannot predict a behavior, it can happen or no. And so from a model validation point of view, from an abstraction point of view, if we go back to computer science, it's a bit problematic. And so the question is exactly that. Is it because of the Boolean specification, or is it because of the semantics? And what we found out is it's that we can have semantics that exactly fix these missing behaviors. And in this article, we introduce a new semantics on Boolean networks that take exactly this, that add no other parameters. It's exactly a different way of computing the simulation, for instance. And it has a guarantee to not miss any behavior that you could achieve just by introducing more information, more parameters in your system. So then in this new semantics, if you predict that it's impossible to activate this gene from this particular initial condition, then it is impossible to have a quantitative model that respects the logic that can achieve it. So now you can start rejecting models and saying this is wrong. So also another point before we maybe describe a bit more this semantics is the computational complexity. Because we want to validate models, and the validation is, as we said, to make sure it can reproduce behaviors we observe in the system. So we need to compute, given a model, if it can go from that point to that other point. And this has a cost. And unfortunately, with this synchronous case, it's a very high cost, which means that on very large networks, it's very, very difficult to compute. We need very big machines, and above a certain size of networks, it's impossible to do. So intuitively, it just comes from the fact that if you want to go from point A to point B, you may have to cross an exponential number of states, and from the theory, we know that we cannot do better than that in general.
Right, because if you have n variables, n Boolean variables, then the number of states of all the combinations is 2 to the power of n.
2 to the power of n, exactly. And you may have to cross all of them in some specific cases. And so this gives you very high potential complexity. So the very two bottlenecks in the Boolean modeling with this asynchronous or synchronous view is that at the same time you may hinder some behaviors of the quantitative system, and it's also very difficult to analyze from a computational point of view. And this was totally unexpected when we did this work, but in our semantics, not only we cover this missing behavior, but it's also much, much simpler to analyze. And under some big classes of networks, we can have now analyze network with several hundred of thousands of different components. So we can apply them at very genome scale models now.
So how does this magical semantics work?
So what's the trick?
Yeah.
Yeah. So one way to explain it is to think at intermediate non-Boolean state. Instead of going straight from 0 to 1, we will say that a component will first go into this increasing state. So it's really pseudo state. We do not change the Boolean nature of the system. Is just a way to think of the way we compute it. But we have this intermediate state which says, okay, this component was 0 and now it is increasing. And what happened here is that now we can say that for some components, it means that it may be already above the interaction threshold. So it can have, for instance, this positive effect on that component. But for some of us, it may not be still high enough to activate or inhibit them. So in this intermediate state, this network might have this dual effect on different components of the system. And then we can recover, correctly abstract the fact that, yeah, we don't know at the Boolean level if this threshold is higher than this or that. So this was, by the way, something which motivated another kind of modeling, which is called multi-level networks, which was a refinement of Boolean networks to consider that node is not 0, 1, but 0, 1, 2, and then you can have this threshold. But you need the parameter of the threshold to execute this model. This is an additional parameter. Here we don't know it. We make the assumption we don't know it. And so we create this intermediate quantic state, or I don't know how you want to...
Like a superposition, them, right? Like almost a quantum superposition of states.
Exactly. And so depending on who reads the node, you will see it at a different value. And then at some point, it will finally go to 1, or change its mind and go back to 0. So it makes the execution of the model a bit more complicated, because we have this way of putting this component into this changing state, and then this produces new behaviors. So in the case of a small example I discussed before, when we activate the signal, it means that the input node will go into this intermediate state. And then we can have this transient activation of 3, because it can be considered high enough to activate the intermediate node 2, and then 3 can activate, because for 3 it can choose to read 0, the 0 value to 1. It can choose that because 1 is already increasing, it's not high enough to inhibit it. And eventually the input will go to fully active, and 3 will go down to 0. But then we can really predict and see this transient activation of 3. So that's basically the idea. And so the proof we have is that any system that respects the logic of the Boolean network, so in terms that have matching derivatives with the Boolean network, will only give a subset of the simulation you can have at the Boolean level with this semantics. So this semantics really capture everything the model can do with this specific logic. But this raises another question from a validation point of view, is what if I do a semantics which allows everything?
Exactly, yeah.
I can go from everywhere to everywhere. So this will perfectly satisfy my validation criteria, which says, okay, if I cannot predict a behavior, then you can reject the model because you will never say it's impossible. And that's what's the true concern with our semantics is that, well, if we allow anything, now it's become useless and you cannot predict anything from it. So that 2 points here. The first is that if you want to satisfy this criteria, which says, I don't want to miss any behavior I can achieve by adding kinetics, speed parameters, quantities, then you need to predict at least what you will predict with this semantics. And the second point, so we have this property of not missing behaviors. We know that we have the minimal way of doing that, because if we you need to predict at least what this semantics, this most permissive semantics predicts. It still doesn't say that on actual models you can predict anything. So what we did is that we picked several models from the literature, and we try to see if, well, we also predict that some behaviors are impossible, and we can go to the same prediction as which has been validated as in other works. And it turns out that yes, despite potentially enabling new behaviors, we are still able to be stringent enough to say that in some situation it's impossible to reach this behavior. And in different cases, we are able to predict the same, for instance, the same control of the system. So it's really to force the system going into that direction than what was done with classical analysis. So this is really a reassuring point to say that yes, we predict more behaviors, but we are still stringent enough to predict, for instance, differentiation processes, where in differentiation what you really want to predict is that once you enter in this differentiation branch of the cell, you cannot reach a different differentiation branch. So this is a key point of this differentiation modeling, and it turns out that is in many models this most permissive semantics is still predictable for these processes.
And what's the significance of two intermediate states? Why couldn't you just have a single intermediate state? So my intuition tells me that that model would be too permissive, so it would allow too much if you cannot differentiate between the growing and the falling activity.
Exactly. That's exactly the point. Is you have constraints to satisfy to go into these intermediate states and then reaching the extremities. So if you start increasing, and you will, in this semantics, eventually you will be able to fully active. There is no constraint on that. But then from this increasing, if you want to go back to zero, to decreasing, you need to have a way to prove that, yes, in this situation you can be deactivated. So you have constraint to go from this increasing to the decreasing state. This you cannot do by default. So this prevents creating some behaviors that will be totally strange. Yes.
Right. And I'm not sure we mentioned that so far, but so you have these theorems that if a specific Boolean network in some sense corresponds to an ODE model, then it can replicate the behavior of the ODE model. But what does it mean for a Boolean network to correspond? So, for example, how do you translate the specific activation functions? How do you decide whether they correspond to a logical AND or a logical or I guess, it could be a sum, right? Like, how do you translate a sum? Is it an AND or an OR? How do you decide all those things?
Yeah, so here you describe the way to do it at the syntactic level. Like you take two specifications and you try to see if you can transform one into the other. But that would be one way to do that. This is not the way we choose. Instead we compare the derivatives. So in ODs you have expression on, if you increase, if you the value you compute is above 0, otherwise you decrease. We say that it is compatible with a Boolean network if you have a way to binarize this continuous state. So to put threshold in your in your continuous domain, so that the components which are decreasing in your ODE, you can turn them off in the binary counterpart of the state. And the nodes which are increasing in your ODE, you can turn them on with the Boolean counterpart of your state. So you need to have this way to translate a continuous state of component into a binary one. And if you have a one which allows you to match the derivative with the Boolean evaluation of your function, then we say that you are respecting the Boolean network. So of course the criteria we choose for that is is an important part of these theorems. This matching of derivative, given that the way to binarize the state is somehow quite free in the way we define it. Just if you quantity is really 0, you don't have the choice to put it to 0. Otherwise, you have the choice. This is quite free, so quite easy to achieve. This is not a very restrictive criteria. So this means that in the future, for instance, we could then study classes, different subclasses of ODE system with different classes of matching with Boolean networks, and maybe have different semantics to satisfy the same criteria.
But do you have, so as you say, you don't consider on a syntactic level, but still, do you have any rules or something where you can say for a given ODE model, oh yes, like we can definitely do this, like there may be others, but just based on looking at the ODE model and on the Boolean model, are there any circumstances where you can say, oh, definitely, like they obviously correspond to one another because of some syntactic properties?
Yes. Depending on how you write your ODE system, yes. And this is what you suggested, is that indeed, if you have additive effect, multiplicative effect, from that you can translate them into and or negation. So there's quite some work on that to show the connection between the models. So yeah. The connection so going from ODEs to Boolean, there's a lot of, it's very different worlds where we go from continuous to discrete and so on. So what we focus on is mainly what these multi-level networks where we stay discrete, but component can have any number of discrete levels that correspond to the different interaction thresholds they may have. And this, the connection is more easy to get, because the way you specify multi-level system is you say that you will increase if this component is below a threshold or above a threshold, and this you can transform them in negation or positively literals and so on. But there are tight connection between multi-valid networks and ODE systems, and then you can do the full path between all these models.
And so a Boolean network can be viewed as like a specific case of a multi-level network where you have just two levels, right? And so, as you say, we need to add these intermediate states to a Boolean semantics to make it expressive enough. I would guess the same is valid for multi-level networks. So there's no some kind of minimum number of levels that would satisfy, that would be always enough?
Minimum no, but maximum yes. You have the fact that you don't need more levels than interaction you have on nodes, because it really comes from the ordering the threshold you have of interaction. So if you interact on 3 components, you need 4 levels, 0, 1, 2, 3. Then you can order all of it. But it introduces a lot of parameters, and in large networks, you may have quite some output interactions, and so it's very difficult to deal at the multi-level model level directly.
But can you imagine a scenario where it would be useful to consider some kind of hybrid, where you would have, for example, 5 levels, and right, so you could introduce some parameters. Maybe you actually want to introduce some parameters to restrict a little bit what the system can do, but in order to compensate for the low number of levels, you would also add these intermediate states like decreasing and increasing to the multi-level network.
Yeah. So that's something we haven't looked so far, but that's indeed a possible future direction, is to try to apply this semantics only on a certain set of nodes, for instance, for which we don't have enough data enough parameters to specify them, and nodes for which we have quite some information, have a more strict semantics for the update. So it will certainly kill the complexity results, because you will also have to account for this node for which is more complex to analyze. But it is, of course, from a modeling point of view, a very attractive direction to go.
So let's talk about complexity. So you mentioned that the complexity for the asynchronous semantics is not great, right? You have this exponential explosion. How exactly does this modify semantics? So the term you use is most permissive Boolean networks, right? That's the name of your semantics. So how exactly does introducing these intermediate states improve the computational complexity of the simulation or the path seeking?
Yeah, so there's again a trick here. So the question we want to solve is you start from a certain configuration X, and you want to know if there is a path to configuration Y. So with asynchronous, you need to find a correct sequence of updates to do that, and it can take an exponential number of steps to do that. With this most permissive semantics, it turns out that a good strategy to reach anything, or a lot of configuration, is to put as much as components you can in this intermediate state. Because when everyone is in increasing or decreasing states, you can choose the way you read them, and it gives you a lot of freedom. And so you may think of an algorithm that tries to put first all at most as possible as component in this intermediate state, and then from that see if you can converge to your final state. And it means that if you can go from X to Y, you always have a shortcut in this semantics. You always have a path which is of linear length in our case. So it means that if you know how to draw this transition between these most permissive states, you just need to find a short path of the constant is 3 of 3n length at most, and if you can't, then it's impossible to reach it because there is this shortcut. But there's here a subtle things is how you compute this transition. How do you know that you can increase this state or decrease this state? Because this, contrary to asynchronous update, is more complex in general, because you have some components which are in this intermediate state, so which are free. You can choose 0 or 1, and you have a function, so logical formula, and you want to know if there's a way to read the component so that this formula is true or false. And in computer science, this is a very classical problem, which is called as a satisfiability problem, and which is an NP-complete one. So it means that knowing if you can go to increase or decrease, you need to solve this SAT problem in general. So knowing if you can go to increase or decreasing in very general is an NP-complete problem. So still, we're not p-space complete as is the reachability problem in asynchronous. But we are NP complete.
And so these are just different computational classes, right? And p-space exactly. Is at least as complex as NP.
Yeah. So we have this. You have this hierarchy of classes for which we don't know if we know the inclusions, but we don't know if they are equal or no. So we don't know if NP is equal to p-space. But in practice, with SAT solvers, you can solve models with millions or billions of variables, depending on the problems. And with p-space in model checking above 100 variables, it starts to be very, very, very difficult. So, but we have this inclusion of classes. The true complexity is a bit more fine than that. You can have the details in the article where somewhere in the polymer hierarchy, so I don't want to enter into the details here. But so it may still appear a bit complex, and it is still a bit complex, but this is in the general case. And in biology, in the network we look at, we are not in this, most of the time we are not in this general case. We are in what we call the locally monotonic case, where a component has always the same sign of influence on another one. You have the fact that one is either nothing for node 3, or an activator or an inhibitor, but it's not at the same time an activator or an inhibitor. In many, many cases, this is an assumption, and this is what we have, that you have either a positive or a negative edge in your network. You don't have both of them. And if you are in this case, the satisfiability problem is very, very simple. It becomes linear, and so we are no longer NP, but we are simply polynomial. So it means that we go from a very extreme complex problems of p-space complete problem for the asynchronous cases to simple polynomial time algorithms. So for these locally monotonic networks, which is really the most common one we encounter in biology, the complexity becomes very, 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 very low.
I'm trying to understand this in more detail. So when you decide whether it's possible to get from state A to state B, and your first step is to make as many as possible variables into the intermediate states, right? Does it matter at all which intermediate states those are? Like whether those are increasing or decreasing? Could there be situations where like some are good and some are like some combinations are good or bad?
So whether you are in increasing or decreasing for the other nodes of the network, it doesn't change. You in both cases, you will have the choice to read a 0 or 1. So the sign of the changes doesn't matter. The order of the changes doesn't matter as well, because what you are interested is put as much as possible as people as components in this intermediate state, and the way that if you put someone in an intermediate state, it will never prevent you to put another one in intermediate state, because when you put someone in intermediate state, you add freedom to the system. The only thing is that sometimes component cannot go back. So if you, as I said before, if you are going in this increasing state, if you want to decrease, you need to satisfy constraints. And so if you put a component which was 0 in this increasing state, and at the end it is a 0, you need to make sure it can go back to 0.
So from 0 it can get to the increasing state, and while it is in the increasing state, you can read 0 off of it, but it's not possible that at the end of the simulation it's still in that intermediate state. So it eventually, at the end, it has to get to 1?
Exactly. And if you want it to get to 0, you need to make it go to this decreasing state. So the simple example is, for instance, a constant function. Let's say that the function says that this component will always get activated at some point. And if it starts in 0, and you put it in this increasing state, you will never be able to make it decrease again, because it started to increase and it's over. You cannot make it change its mind. So it means that when you compute these shortcuts, you want to put as much as component as possible in this intermediate state, but some of them you shouldn't put them into this increasing state, otherwise you cannot reach your target.
Yeah, which sounds to me like a contradiction. So is it as many as possible, or as many as possible minus some?
to reach the target, exactly. Yeah. So it's not as much as possible, period. It's much as possible for your property.
So, for example, if you see that in your final state it's 0 and in your initial state it's 0, you don't want to put it into the intermediate state. Is that correct? Or
you will try to avoid it. Sometimes you need to, because some of the nodes will need a transient activation of it. And if you're able to make it go back to 0, then you're fine. But sometimes it won't be possible, and then we will say that it's impossible to reach your target.
Okay, so it still involves some kind of guessing, some kind of state space search, right? It's not as simple as go from this subspace to that subspace.
Yes, but you have good properties. For instance, you know that if a node is different in the initial and final state, well, it needs to go to this intermediate state. If it doesn't, maybe not. And so here there is a choice of the algorithm of choice to do that. But there is a good property is that, for instance, so the algorithm is really, we have a greedy algorithm, for instance, which puts exactly all, at most as possible, component in this intermediate state, and then checks. And if it finds component for which it cannot go back, we will start the computation and say, okay, this one, don't change them because you won't be able to go back. And we have good ordering property which says that we can do that in this greedy manner. And so we repeat the algorithm as long as we have contradictions, and we prevent some nodes to go to this intermediate state. And things are that at the end you will converge, and you need to do that at most n time. So you need n time to repeat the algorithm in the worst case. So this is why it is polynomial and not linear.
Right, I see. So you proved a bunch of interesting theorems in your paper, but is there a software package that someone who works with these networks that someone could use?
Yeah, sure. So we developed a small Python package that you can use to compute this reachability, so the existence of trajectory between configuration. So it takes any Boolean network you can have in the literature, and then you can do the computation using this tool. So this is another property we haven't spoke about because it's really for a property which a bit more complex. It's what we call attractors, which characterize the steady states of the system. So either everyone is happy and so you have no evolution as possible, or you have these limit cycles where the system enter sustained oscillations. So this is also another key property we look at for modeling when modeling with Boolean networks and other kind of models. And we also have much lower complexity for this kind of property, and the tool also allows you to compute these attractors, and the attractors you can reach from a given initial configuration. So this is typically the kind of analysis you do for differentiation processes, where you have your initial state and you want to know which phenotypes, so which stable configuration you can reach from this particular condition. So all of this you can do with this small tool, and we have another ongoing tool in development to do the inference of networks. So now you have data, you don't have the logic, and you want to find automatically Boolean networks that can reproduce the data. And thanks to the low complexity of most permissive Boolean networks, we can now do it at very, very large scale compared to asynchronous interpretations. And so this is ongoing work and will be published soon.
No, but this is very cool, right? It feels like this is almost like a revolution in the Boolean network modeling. Like if someone uses Boolean networks, it seems like there's no reason not to switch to this semantics, right? Because not only it's superior theoretically, like semantically, but also it's practically more feasible because of the complexity considerations, right? So hopefully, like if, you know, it would be a disappointment if the field doesn't switch to this paradigm.
Oh, I totally agree with you. No, well, it's the choice of semantics is something which well, is a strong concern in the community. There are a lot of questions related to it. So yeah, this solves a lot of questions. This most permissive Boolean networks. Still, in some situation, you may want to have restrictive, more restrictive way to compute what is possible in the system, depending on the hypothesis you may have on it. So it really depends on the kind of analysis you want to do. But it's true that if you want to deal with quantitative data, with model validation, from my point of view, it's better to go to more hybrid modeling, as we discussed before, where for some nodes we have this most permissive behavior because we don't have enough parameters, and for some of them we introduce additional levels rather than fixing an arbitrary subsemantics, which is very difficult to really understand the effect it has on the simulation you can do. So I hope it will be progressively adopted, yes, and there's a lot of communication to do and explanation to explain the properties. So we'll see how it goes.
Cool. Loïc, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you very much.